Great, so this is recording. Hello everyone, this is the last clip of this week's lecture on colonialism. And as promised and trailed in previous clips, we have the enormous of having our colleague Ashraf Hoque, or Ash as he goes by, addressing this topic with us. Ash is a person that I've known since, I think, 2013. Is that right, Ash? Probably.
I think so, yeah.
When we were both working on big kind of projects to do. So Ash was working on a project with Lucia Michelutti on crime and bossism and kind of muscular politics in South Asia. Really, really interesting research. I was doing a project with other friends, common friends as well, on revolutions viewed anthropologically. So we kind of bonded intellectually as well as personally at that time, working in the same department on the same kind, not same, but kind of related issues. And yeah, Ash is just brilliant in all sorts of ways. And he's a colleague at UCL. He works in the Institute of Education as a kind of anthropological researcher, teacher, and so on. And crucially for this week, his work in many ways broaches directly questions of colonialism and is informed in ways that I hope he'll be able to elaborate on in a number of ways by kind of the kinds of questions that we've been looking at in the readings this week and in the other clips, that kind of overlap or tension perhaps, or dialogue at least, between anthropological ways of approaching things and post-colonial theory, for example. I know from anecdotally that knows Paul Gilroy, for example, who's one of the guys that was in one of the pictures that I put up before, the author of Black Atlantic. So, you know, there's a lot of ways in which Ash's work speaks directly to these themes. So let's kick off this chat, Ash, shall we, with just an invitation to you to just elaborate a little bit on how you see your work, maybe say a little bit about what your work is, because the students, of course, don't know that. And secondly, particularly how questions of colonialism have fed into it.
Yes, thank you, Martin. A very lovely introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Ash. It's a real pleasure for me to be participating in this very, very important week of topics. Martin went through what you guys will be discussing this week, or have already, I don't know if they've already seen those clips, Martin, but you know, it seems very, very, very interesting, and I'm very, very happy and honoured to be part of that. So I should tell you a little bit about myself at this juncture. It's always difficult to talk about oneself, but I feel I have to talk about a little bit about myself, given the nature of the topic today. I am broad. I'm going to start back to front. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work generally, and then I will talk about a little bit about myself. So my work broadly focuses on themes of migration and diaspora, the anthropology of Islam, and political anthropology, specifically the sociology of gender, religion, and politics. So I look at the intersections of all of these various epistemological enclaves, if you like. And I have conducted ethnographic fieldwork in Luton in Bedfordshire. Some of you might be aware of Luton. If you are, you probably won't have a very high opinion of Luton. Luton is interesting because it's got about a 20% population of Muslims or South Asians, occupied in a very sort of concentrated area of the town. And in England, I also worked in Tower Hamlets, which again has a very, very large concentration of South Asian people of South Asian origin, in that case Bangladeshi origin, that have been there in as a large sort of community since the sort of early 1970s, but in smaller iterations before that, in the post-war period and just before the war period. And I've also worked in Bangladesh, in Sylhet, which is the northeastern corner of what is now Bangladesh, which was before that East Pakistan, and before that part of the British Raj, or the Bengal Presidency, or then it was also part of the Assam province as well. And Sylhet is interesting because 95% of British Bangladeshis are from Sylhet. So actually a lot of my interlocutors in Luton, some of whom were Bangladeshi, and my interlocutors in Tower Hamlets, the majority of whom were from Bangladesh, actually all invariably came from a certain area within Sylhet called the Londony Belt in the literature. So that's my topical focus, if you like, and my sort of regional focus. I do something a bit different to your traditional anthropologists in that I look at multi-sitedness. So my methodological approach is looking at various sites rather than one site. So I try to sort of critique methodological nationalism, which has dominated the discipline from its outset. Now, I should tell you, if I've got time, Marta, I should quickly tell you about why I got interested in anthropology. Unlike a lot of my colleagues, for me, anthropology, the interest in it was sparked by my own background and by a particular political moment in my life. And that occurred in the aftermath of 9/11, as well, you'd probably be too young to remember 9/11. How does that sound, Martin? Makes you feel
God. Shocking.
But then after that, you had the London bombings of 2005, which again was now a long time ago, 15 years ago. And at that time, I was actually a undergraduate master's student. And I remember in the aftermath of these events that there was a lot of talk about Muslims in the public sphere. A lot of media discourses and a lot of policy making going on in that time. And I starkly remember that they had completely got Muslims wrong, for want of a better expression. And I thought that this needs to be remedied. I thought that there are so many multifarious and heterogeneous voices among certainly British Muslim communities, and by extension globally, that have been completely muted and glossed over by this wider geopolitical and quite monolithic narrative. And at the time I was studying, well, my undergraduate was in history, but I was always very interested in anthropology. And it made me even more interested in anthropology because I thought this was the only sort of real field that humanizes people. My understanding of anthropology at the time was that. So actually, in many ways, it's what I'm saying now is a defense of anthropology. Yes, it's a colonial discipline. Yes, it's loaded in all sorts of nefarious power relations. But for me, certainly, I found a way of appropriating its sort of disciplinary reach in a way that could shed light on areas and of people and of communities that would otherwise not have been touched by other disciplines, other more sort of top-down disciplines. Including sociology, which is very much, it's quants, it's mixed method, so it's quants and quals, so they don't have that sort of necessarily that sort of immersive flavor, although that's changing too. So in many ways, although I was naive at the time, I didn't realize, but I was engaging in a form of autonomy, as well as engaging as an anthropologist. That in itself has problems because I found that I was very different to the people that I studied both in East London and in Luton, and indeed people in Sylhet, Bangladesh. And that begs the question of whether or not anthropologists can ever be part of any community. I think we're perennial freaks and outsiders and we don't belong anywhere. But anyway, that's another conversation we can have maybe if Martin wants to pick it up later. But I'll leave it there for now because I realised I've been droning on for too long.
So, I mean, in so much, thanks, Ash. That's really a fantastic way to introduce it. In so much of what you said, it's already evident that questions of colonialism are feeding into what you're looking at. But can you just bring that into focus a little bit for us to see? Look, so the way that you examine the experience of people in Tower Hamlets, in Luton, and in Sylhet, kind of drawn together with reference to the colonial and post-colonial experience of Bangladesh and South Asia more broadly, or how do you broach the question of colonialism in tackling these topics?
No, totally. I mean, I'm very historical. Oh, I should mention that my theoretically, I'm also quite intersectional. So I'm couched, I suppose, in sort of classical and neo-Marxist approaches, specifically Gramscian approaches. I'm also post-structuralist in the way that I look at things. So, Foucault is very prominent in my work. And also post-colonial. So I have Gilroy, Hall, Barber, Fanon, Spivak very much informing my work. So again, I'm quite intersectional in the way that I approach anthropology. But in direct response to your question, Martin, the communities that I've worked with have all suffered some sort of violence, and I mean that not physical violence, but some sort of violence or rupture or dislocation as a consequence of the colonial encounter, historic colonial encounter. And if you'll notice by my three theoretical influences, but all three of them have history front and center in their approach. So the mere fact we have South Asian communities in the UK is testament and residue of the colonial encounter, right? Going back to South Asia. And also in the 20th century, after the World War, 45, Britain opened up, it called its colonies into action to come and rebuild it, right? So there was a lot of labor migrations that occurred as a consequence of that. So these communities, the Windrush generation now being referred to, people came from the Caribbean, came from South Asia predominantly, and set up here. And once they set up here, they were received in a very hostile way, which then made them sort of engage in moments of mobilization. This is where the politics of my work comes in. Obviously, labor migration is where the economics of my work comes in. Colonialism is where the history of my work comes in. And the anthropological aspect of it is obviously, looking at the communities in sort of contemporary context and trying to sort of, fit those different influences and historical moments together. So that's how my work is. I mean, we can talk about it all day, but that's how, to give you a sort of flavor of how it intersects with colonialism.
Brilliant, thank you, excellent. You already mentioned the kind of three sources of influence in, that you bring into your attempt to kind of deal with these questions. I guess part of the remit, or whatever it is, scope of this week's lecture that we're having is really to see the ways in which anthropologists have drawn on post-colonial theory in particular, and somehow found ways to marry it up, or perhaps critically not marry it up, with more self-consciously anthropological approaches to these kinds of questions, right? Mm. So I'm just wondering whether you had a view or an account in relation to your own work of how you drew on these two, and maybe you might think the distinction is artificial, in which case that's interesting as well, right? But in my mind, the trajectory of anthropology and the trajectory of post-colonial theory are, obviously related but separate, and in many ways post-colonial theory is very critical of anthropology, and anthropology has often been quite reticent or had difficulty with incorporating or engaging with post-colonial theory. So I just wonder, as a person who has grappled with both of those traditions, how you went about that, how you feel about it.
Very good question. I mean, there's two approaches, two things I would say in response to that. Firstly, that I was, my training was not a separation between those two things. So I went to SOAS, I probably didn't mention that, but I was trained completely at SOAS. So I did my undergraduate, master's and my PhD studies there. And the way that we were trained, our teachers, what we read, how we prepared for field work, we were cognizant of the fact that, there was traditional anthropology and then there was what we're being taught. But we didn't dwell so much on those debates. So it's only after I sort of came of age, if you like, as a scholar, and I moved out of SOAS and I started presenting in different places and meeting other scholars and working at UCL and other places, that I became fully cognizant of this divide. So in my formative years, I certainly didn't think too much about this division. It was always something that happened in anthropology. It was part of its epistemological development, part of its history, but now it was being reappropriated in a way which is far more couched in that sort of approach. The second part of my response would be that, we can probably talk about this a bit later, but classical anthropology never really appealed to me precisely because I couldn't relate to it. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't understand this distinction that, for want of a better term, classical anthropologists did which was this division between modern society and traditional societies, and modern societies as a sort of sui generis entity, and looking at traditional societies as these sort of bounded cultural worlds. You know, for me, that always seemed to be problematic, because phenomena doesn't work like that, right? And the world that we live in is always collapsed, right? There are always fragments of different epistemological, historical, economic, political influences everywhere. I mean, you could go to the most remote place in the world, and they still are couched within a nation state. And, you know, if they're indigenous people, they will be engaging with the state. They'll know that the state is there. They'll know of some services. Invariably, there's a will among those people to accept some aspects of modernity, like cash or, you know, development projects or whatever else. So the way that I was trained always made that, it always felt like that was common sense. And then later on, when I discovered that there was this sort of attempt to separate the epistemes, it always didn't sit very well with me. You know, I understood that that was the case, but for me, anthropology didn't have to be that way.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I want to ask a supplementary question that I didn't prepare, that isn't really part necessarily of this thing, but I can't resist asking it, because we've had this discussion before a lot, you know, the two of us. So I thought, let us share it with the students. You know, why not?
We're friends, by the way, guys. So that's why.
Yeah, exactly. We've had a whole, I'm going to be completely full disclosure, we're having a whole argument here, which we've had many times before, about other things, about whether Ash should be paid for this or not. Like, you know, is he doing a favor because of our friendship? I'm trying to keep it super professional. He's like saying, oh, I don't want to fill all of the paperwork, give me a break. So that's the kind of level at which we're operating, just so you all know, guys, what's happening. But he's going to get paid for it. Either that, or you're going to invite me back to give an interview to your students, but you don't want your students to hear me, so...
No, I do. I got to think about how.
Yeah.
I need to think about this anyway.
Anyway, coming back, sorry to derail this, but there you go. Is this question of Islamic scholarship, which is different, of course, from post-colonial studies, but it is another, because you're right, of course, you know, I mean, really interesting and important point that being educated in SOAS, you know, that distinction that I made, it just was parochial. It was like old news. It's like, what are you talking about? You know, we're past that kind of thing, right? Whereas when you came to UCL, perhaps, or when I was educated in LSE and other places, I was just completely, you know, assumed that anthropology had its own kind of limitations, and post-colonial theory was an external influence, right? You're saying to you it wasn't even external, right? Which I think is a really interesting point. And a corrective, perhaps, to the way that I've gone about presenting those clips, you know, that the students would have watched, because there I talk about these two things being separate and being kind of influencing each other. So that's really interesting. But anyway, I know that by virtue of the fact of doing an anthropology of Islam, you have a very strong kind of proclivity to actually incorporate within your understanding as an anthropologist of these kinds of phenomena the work of Islamic scholars, of Muslim scholars, of, you know, centuries of traditions, but also in contemporary debates and so on. So I was just wondering, do you see their attention? Like, does that ever sit in tension with the kind of anthropology of Islam that, you know, you like, for example, with the students we've discussed as in a different context. This is obviously not an anthropology of Islam course. And just briefly kind of looked at the arguments by Sabah Mahmoud in The Politics of Piety, that basically, you know, freedom and subjectivity and all that needs to be radically to be reconsidered if you are based on the kind of ethnography of piety movements in Cairo, as she did, right? And her critique of feminism and so on. So, you know, that kind of tradition of anthropology of Islam is obviously extremely strong, and I know you're, you know, engaging with that. So how do you marry that up with your deep interest in kind of Muslim philosophy or theology?
No, great question, brilliant question. This is really interesting, and again, I could blabber on forever, but just to answer it directly of how do I marry it, I include it, and I'm going through a process now where, I mean, we can't find bloody time because of coronavirus. We haven't had the chance to write anything, have we, Martin? But there's a whole sort of, backlog of things that I need to get out. But some of the things that I'm working on now are exactly in this area.
Mm.
I have to give kudos to people like Ernest Gellner, who's a very controversial figure in anthropology. Most people don't agree with him. I love him. I don't agree with him, but I love him. There's a distinction. Because I think it was very bold and original, and he was uncompromising in what he believed intellectually to be correct, and I respect that. But he had a famous work called Muslim Society, and he misappropriated, but nevertheless embraced the theories of a very famous Islamic scholar Muslim scholar called Ibn Khaldun, who many have argued is the father of history, the father of sociology, the father of anthropology. He's an ethnographer as well, and he's got a massive tomes and tomes of work actually on this.
When did Ibn Khaldun live?
14th century.
14th century.
North Africa. Tunis he was born, but he lived for a while in Cairo, lived for a while in Damascus. I think he also went to the Vatican at some stage as well. He was a statesman as well. So he was a scholar and a statesman. And if your students are doing the decolonized, I don't know what it's called, but I'm teaching Ibn Khaldun on that course next term. So it might be interested in that. So Ernest Gellner does, embrace the work of Ibn Khaldun. Doesn't quite get it right. Doesn't quite really understand, but he incorporates Ibn Khaldun in a way where he treats this particular scholar in the same way that he treats Durkheim in that book. Mm-hmm. That was really, really refreshing. It's really, really refreshing, but it's unusual. So even the work that you were talking about with Saba Mahmood, I mean, I love that work. I love Saba Mahmood. God rest her. I hope she rests in peace. But in her work, she talks about how rehearsed spontaneity is Aristotelian, right? Mm. Looking at Aristotle's posterior metaphysics. And that's right. But it got to Islam via Islamic scholars, via people like Avicenna, via people like Al-Ghazali, via all sorts of other scholars who really engaged with Neoplatonic thought. And added an Islamic theological flavor to that thought, right? To such a degree and to such depth that even in, the Cairo in the 1990s, it's still relevant for a whole bunch of women who are agentive and want to claim Islam for themselves, right? Yeah. So that, I think I touched on this point before, but there's been a cutoff in anthropology where all of a sudden anything that's theoretically worthy starts from Enlightenment and from then on. Whereas if we actually are scholarly about intellectual history and about if we are appropriately historiographical, we will understand that there was a whole Mediterranean intellectual economy that was operating from the time of the Greeks that went around, literally clockwise around the Mediterranean and came back round again. Which created the cultural impetus for the Renaissance and then later the Enlightenment thinking. It's like, scientific method or reason. Reason is a word in Arabic which is aql, which was directly lifted from Greek philosophies. Aristotle was very, very huge in the Islamic world. Most of these scholars that I talk about just refer to him as the philosopher. He's not even Aristotle, he's just called the philosopher. So anyway, all of this needs to be married. Direct answer to your question, it needs to be married. Anthropologists who are working on Islam need to understand that. There are some, like Mittermeier, for example, she refers to Ghazali's work. There are some that do that, but certainly within the whole sort of lived tradition camp, as you put it the other week, which is really interesting and funny. The lived tradition camp, there's no interest in that whatsoever, right? And I think that's highly problematic because it still resonates with Muslims all over the world.
That's so interesting. You can kind of reimagine the whole project for anthropological theorizing in that way, can't you? Which I know is your project, really. Now, you made one statement there, which is a perfect segue to my next question, which is there's this thing in anthropology that legitimate theorizing starts from the Enlightenment. You know, there's a cutoff point, and then it has to be like that. And of course, that brings to mind the kinds of arguments that the two authors that we've read for this week, both Edward Said and Trujillo, make, which is the kind of inherently colonial character of the knowledge project of anthropology, the intellectual project of anthropology, as it was constituted, obviously in the 19th century, but all the way through to today, right? Not that that was something in the past, but it's always been like that, and it ever has been thus, or whatever the English people say, and it still is today, right? So this idea of the inherently colonial dynamic of anthropology as a discipline. You mentioned Foucault earlier on. I mean, that's obviously an important influence also in Said, seeing basically anthropology as an episteme, and, you know, the kind of old pithy formula, knowledge is power. You know, anthropological knowledge is part of colonial power, is part of the argument that Edward Said is making. So I'm just wondering what your take on those issues are. I mean, you said before that, of course, anthropology is a colonial project. Can you elaborate on that and how you nevertheless see your own position within it or next to it, or etc.?
Yeah, fantastic question. I agree with Said and Trujillo and these characters, right? I think that they're in making those observations, but at the same time, I think there's still hope for the discipline. And this is where I've got a radical sensibility here. If anthropology carries on the way it is, reproducing, I don't think it's gonna die. In my opinion, it's going to suffer the fate of eugenics, for example, right? Because a lot of the world has cottoned on to the fact that it is inherently colonial, and if it's inherently colonial, there's power relations there, and we know that racism, for example, is a demonstration of power, right? So it's going to suffer that same death that other pseudosciences or racist discourses, frankly, have suffered. However, it doesn't need to be that way. And for me, anthropology that can come out of it is to be multidisciplinary, is to adopt insights and approaches from other disciplines. So, for example, at the moment, I mean, I teach in the UCL Social Research Institute, and they've recently just started a BSc sociology degree. It's the first sociology degree that has been ever offered at UCL, which is quite interesting. And I teach on one of the core courses, the historical foundations of sociological thought. And the whole degree, including my course, there's a sort of unique selling point, which is we have to look at things in a globalized way, right? So we have to make sure that we have to break this idea of Eurocentrism. And the division between metropole and the colony, right? Which is very, you know, post-Enlightenment, French Revolution, blah blah blah. And the way that we're doing it in our department is precisely that. We're arguing that there is such a thing as connected sociologies, right? So there are, you know, the French Revolution just didn't happen in Europe. Had an impact around the world, and actually around the world had an impact on the French Revolution. If you just look at the Haitian Revolution, for example, how that revolution impacted what happened in the metropole and changed it, irrevocably. Yeah. So how do we do that? So anthropologists need to first of all get out of this reproduction sort of, you know, policing the boundaries of the discipline. What I mean by that, if I may, Martin, very quickly, I just want to give a very, very quick example. So recently I was looking at, I was reading something about the gift, Mouse's gift, Martin, which you were an absolute sort of paragon of. And I was looking at some of the Malinowski lectures from LSE, Martin. First of all, Malinowski, yes, he made a massive contribution to anthropology, but I mean, if you read his diaries, you realise how racist he was, and we shouldn't be lauding him with titles such as Malinowski lectures. Anyway, that's another point. But I was reading some of these Malinowski lectures, and I realised that I'm not going to give names, and I'm not going to say whose paper it was and when it was or anything. I don't want to give anything away. But the entire paper, the lecture, was just a rollout of every LSE anthropologist that's ever gone through that department. Literally everyone, one after the other, one after the other, one after the other, and to this particular person's seat, you know, talking about the gift. This sort of thing is not helpful, right? There's an, you know, enigmatic, almost incestuous sort of spinning around amongst ourselves, which is not helpful. And there's a particular demographic of people that insist of doing that, right? We need to come out of that. We need to open up, you know, we need to look at, see what other departments are doing, see what other scholars are doing, see what people who are also anthropologists in South Asia are doing, and see how they approach things, right? So I work in Bangladesh, and there are brilliant, brilliant people there. I mean, it's of course there are brilliant people. It's almost shameful for me to say that. But the kind of the way that they look at the world is so interesting and actually erudite, far more than I could ever be, right? But my stuff on Bangladesh gets published. Their stuff on Bangladesh gets published in a regional publishing house that nobody reads apart from their students, right? And maybe other colleagues in their department. So I think that you know, all of this that I'm talking about is the legacy of colonialism, is the legacy of that power relations, right? Or is that legacy of that reproduction of knowledge and power, knowledge and power, knowledge and power. And the way to get out of it is to stop looking inward and start looking outward.
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant answer. Thank you. That's brilliant. I'm stuck for words. I just keep saying brilliant. So listen, Ash, we've got to draw it to a close, but you did mention your participation in this decolonizing anthropology module next term. So next week on this course, we're going to be discussing decolonizing. And as you know, I have a particular kind of take on that, which I don't think is going to satisfy my students very much necessarily, but we'll talk about that next week. But I thought it'd be, since we have you here, it'd be really great to hear just in a couple of minutes or something, what your take on this very hot kind of question at the moment, or for some time now in anthropology, is. Like, you know, what do you think, how might anthropology go about decolonizing? What does that mean for you? Is it even possible, etc.? You've already answered it in a sense. This looking outwards, I think, is a really pithy way to summarize something that should be obvious, but at the same time is incredibly meets a huge amount of resistance within anthropology still, right? And that's the problem. But have you got some more thoughts to close with for our students who want to hear Ash Hoque's take on decolonizing?
I'm sure they don't want to hear that, but I've got a few things to bang about this.
Great.
First, the whole debate on this is unsophisticated, in my opinion, because people seem to think that adding a few people on the, you know, adding a few women on the reading list, adding a few black people, adding a few, you know, queer people, means that it's job done and great, we've decolonized. That's nonsense, because it's such a complex issue. For example, W8C5, who I love, he's a hero of mine, another one, absolute legend of the arts, humanities, and social sciences, I would argue. But Spivak is from a very, very privileged background in Bengal, as indeed I am, you know. So when you talk about can the subaltern speak, the irony, I mean, he couldn't write it, right?
Just for the students, Spivak wrote this very famous article called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" Just close bracket, because the students might not know it. Carry on.
Yeah, very, very famous classical piece. I mean, that's a great piece, but the point is that who's writing that? The person who's writing it is not subaltern, right? So by including that within the paper, yes, I would include it. Of course, I teach that paper. Yeah. But it doesn't automatically decolonize what is inherently a very is the establishment. I mean, universities are the seats of power, right? So how do we get what Gramsci would call subalterns to come up and represent themselves? I mean, it's patronizing for us even to have pretensions that could happen, yeah. Right? So what is it that we're looking for, right? What we're looking for, and I think, is critical thought. That's the most important thing, right? You don't want your lecturer standing up and saying, this is the truth. You know, you want your lecturer standing up and say, look, you need to contextualize me, you need to contextualize yourself, you need to understand my positionality, where I've come from, where I'm, you know, producing this, you know, these fragments of knowledge that I'm producing is not the end. In fact, it's a process. And that process never ends. And we keep adding to it and we keep adding to it, right? And the real way of decolonizing is to be sensitive to where everything has come from, you know, and understanding that that at times, you know, it's going to be incoherent, it's going to be fragmentary, it's going to be contradictory, right? But that lesson in itself is what, for me, is decolonizing is all about, right? You know, I could sit here and say, oh, you know, I'm from, you know, my father was an economic migrant and I'm South Asian and I'm Muslim and therefore I'm a paragon of everything decolonized. But I'm not. The fact is that I'm not. There are some things that I can, in a very sort of fragmentary way, I can contribute to that debate, but it requires others to contribute to that debate as well, and for that momentum to build. And it's an, you know, it's an always in flux process. It's never ending. It's never complete. As Stuart Hall would say, culture is never complete, right? Intellectual, you know, in the context of Gramsci's intellectual, organic intellectual, that process is long, it's arduous, it takes a long, long time. And Gramsci himself says we might never ever get there. But what's important is the spirit of trying to understand that there's a problem, right? And if your lecturers aren't understanding that there's a problem, are not sensitive to that, then that is the problem.
Yeah. Wow. So grateful, Ash. I mean, I'm so glad I asked you to do this and that you said yes, because I think, you know, we put on the table so many interesting things for our students to think about, and so many important things for all of us to think about, certainly me as well. I have to say that this year has been a massive learning curve for me personally, so on. And so having these conversations is just, and exactly this awareness, right, and this kind of open-ended project, inherently incomplete but directional, right, project. It's just a privilege to be part of this conversation. So thank you very much indeed, Ash. It's been fantastic to have you.
Thank you for inviting me. What a pleasure. Always good to see you, Martin. Hope I can see you without the screen at some point this century.
I know, this century, tell me about it. All right, that's the end of this clip, guys. I will see you when I see you. See you later.